Hi everyone, welcome back. Today's video is going to be a fun tag because it is all about eyeshadow palettes, which is hands down my favorite thing to talk about in makeup. I did see this tag video over on Angie's channel, so I will link to her video down below, but I can't remember who the creator of the tag was off the top of my head, but I will find that out and I will put their link down below as well. Without further ado, let's get into the questions. The first one is show us your newest eyeshadow palette, and for me that's the Tati Beauty Textured Neutrals Volume 1. I picked this up, man, the months are slipping away on me now. I think this was my last palette purchase. Anyway, I picked this up a few months ago. I have since gone on basically a makeup no-buy just because we're in quarantine and I don't want to spend my money on makeup at the moment, but I'm pretty sure this was my last purchase. I held off buying this because I didn't think I needed it because it's a neutral palette, and really, do I need another neutral palette? But the reality is that this is amazing. And I know I've talked about this a lot recently in videos, so I don't want to yammer on too much about it, but this is 100% worth the money if you are into the colors. I don't wear neutrals a ton, but I was super curious about this palette just because I'd heard the hype on it and I wanted to know more. And I tell you what, I love this thing to pieces. I love the glitter row, I love the mattes, I love the shimmers so much. This was worth the spend because I think it was close to like 80 bucks with like taxes and shipping and conversion into Canadian funds. But this is my newest one and I'm so happy that I picked it up. Even though I kind of hemmed and hawed over it, this was definitely worth the funds for it. The next one is show us your oldest palette, and the original Naked palette by Urban Decay. This one is pretty much what started it all for me. I mean, eyeshadow palettes weren't really a thing, I feel like, until this came out on the market and kind of opened everybody's eyes. It is a very much well-loved palette. I've hit pan on Toasted and Virgin, and I don't use it a ton now, but it still performs very good. Like, I don't have any issues with pigmentation or it's crumbling on me, even though this is very old at this point. This used to be my go-to palette for interviews at work. And what do I mean it used to be? This still is my go-to palette for interviews at work. I haven't been on one in like a year and a half, but there's something about this palette that I feel very put together when I'm wearing the eyeshadows in here, so I always use it for interviews to give me a little bit of a boost of confidence. And obviously it's a neutral palette, so, you know, going on an interview feels like you should be wearing neutrals kind of thing. Anyway, this palette is special because my friend in the US, Dee, brought this up from the US to Canada when she came for my wedding, because at the time I don't feel like this was easily accessible in Canada. I feel like we got a shipment here and then it sold out and I just didn't get my hands on it, and she brought this up, and you know, just tying that together with her picking it up for me and bringing it from the US just feels like a super special palette. But yeah, this one is definitely my oldest. The next one says to show your most expensive palette, and for me that's my Viseart Editorial Brights palette. Except I did get this at a discount because I bought it at IMATS. In Canada, the editorial palettes all retail for 100 bucks, which is super expensive, but I'm pretty sure I spent $80 Canadian at IMATS for this one. So I think it's my most expensive palette, and retail wise it definitely is, but I know I didn't spend the full retail price for it. Anyway, I do really like this palette. I find it enjoyable to use, but I don't know if I would consider it a $100 quality eyeshadow palette. Like, they're good, but I have ColourPop eyeshadows that perform just as nice, if not better than these shadows. So it was nice to pick up because I do love rainbow palettes, but at the end of the day, it has stopped me from buying any more Viseart palettes because I just don't feel like the quality in this one was representational of $100 worth, you know what I mean? So it's nice to have. I'm not regretful that I picked it up, but I just don't think the price tag equates with the quality here. The next question is show us your most affordable palette. And I've got a few of them in my collection. I'm not exactly sure the dollar price point on all of them, but I think they're around the $3.99 to $4.99 mark, and they are like these 6-pan palettes by Wet n Wild. I've had a lot of these over the years and I've decluttered a few of them just because I wasn't really using them, but this is the one that's held on for the longest. So this is the California Roll 6-pan palette. I love the shades in here, and I think it was $3.99, $4.99. I'm not entirely positive, and I really don't think I have another palette in my collection that is cheaper than that. This one is kind of special to me because it did have this bright red shade down here, which wasn't really popular at the drugstore when this came out, which I don't know, was it 5 years ago now that they had this collection? So I was really happy to get my hands on this. I did end up buying the entire collection, but I decluttered most of it just because I wasn't using it, but this is the only one that has stuck around. So I'm fairly, oh, I thought maybe there was a price tag on the back. It just has a Rexall stamp for the drugstore that I picked it up at. Sadly, no price tag though, but I'm fairly confident that this is my most inexpensive palette. And I don't own any e.l.f. eyeshadow palettes, so I could not have picked any of those. Okay, so the next one says to show us your everyday palette. And that's kind of difficult because I don't have a palette I reach for every day. As you may well see and know, I wear very colorful makeup and I'm generally changing what I'm wearing on the daily. So it's very rare for me to have like an everyday kind of palette, but I can point out the palette that I have used the most consistently in the last year. So I guess that kind of counts as an everyday palette, and that is the ColourPop Chasing Rainbows palette. This is another one that I've talked a lot about recently, so I don't want to rehash too much, but this is my idea of an everyday palette. They are bright without being too neon. There's some neutrals in here, but my idea of a neutral is more like a subdued color. So you've got something that's like a little bit more peach over here that's a little bit more subdued and not as like vibrant necessarily. You've got purples over here, which I feel like are fairly easy color for most people to wear. And then you've got some beautiful turquoises down here. You've got this duochrome kind of blue-brown type pigment. You've got this like taupey gray. So this is along the lines of what I would consider an everyday palette, just because I can make this a little bit more bright, or I can tone it down and make it a little bit more what people call wearable. But I think all makeup colors are wearable, so that's not really a good statement for me. This has consistently been my most used palette, so I would have to say that this is more along the lines of my most everyday palette if I had to pick one. The next question is show your most colorful palette, and honestly so much of what I own is colorful, so I went for colorful but also volume. So I have to mention the Kat Von D Me Vida Loca Remix palette, just because there is so much in here and it's a rainbow wheel. I mean, like, this is relatively comparable to the Visart Editorial Brights in terms of how bright it is, but because there's so many more shades in here, I just had to bring this up. Now, this is a palette that I've been enamored with since it first came out. Was it 2013 or 2014? God, that's going back quite a few years now. And I still love this palette, but I've mentioned before that this is just too cumbersome to reach for all the time. And yes, I realize I could depot it, but I don't like depotting eyeshadow palettes because I do like packaging. And even though I'm like annoyed with this type of packaging, I really don't want to depot it. So I do find that I don't reach for this that much just because it's so cumbersome to like pull out the sleeve. Like, you put this on your desk, look how much space it's taking up. Even if you like lay it on top, it's kind of ridiculous. So this is definitely my most colorful just because it's got the most array of rainbow in here. But yeah, I'm sad that I don't use this more, but every time I pull it out, I'm just like, no, find something smaller. This is just too big overall. The next question is show us your smallest palette. And I think this is it, like the Charlotte Tilbury ones. They're 4-pan quads. I have, I think 4 or 5 of them. They may only have 4 shades, but they are super expensive. These are like 64 Canadian dollars, which is just unreal. And I definitely fell into the Charlotte Tilbury hype when she first launched in Canada, and I'm not regretful for spending the money on these, but $64 for 4 shadows is a lot of money. So these are definitely my smallest eyeshadow palettes. I got a few more of them, and I was trying to think if I had anything remotely smaller. Like, do I even have a 3-pan palette? And I can't think of anything, so I'm pretty sure these are my smallest ones. The next one is show us your biggest palette. And I went with the Morphe and Jaclyn Hill palette just because it has the most eyeshadows in here. I'm pretty sure there's 35 in these suckers. I could have shown you the Kat Von D Metal Matte palette because it's so big. It's like this big and massive, but there's not as many shadows in it as there are in this one. So I thought this one would be worthwhile mentioning. It's fine. I have no issues with the quality. This is one of the original formula ones, so I know I got the good one. But I just find it's too repetitive, and this is very common for Morphe eyeshadow palettes, so I shouldn't really be complaining that much. But this whole like section over here is so similar that it's just so seriously unnecessary. And I found it really bizarre that there is no matte bone cream color shade in here. The ones up here are both like satin or shimmery, which is just a little bit strange. And considering that there's 35 freaking shadows in here, you think they would have had like a matte bone colored shade. Anyway, I don't reach for this really that often, but I don't get rid of it because it is actually quite nice to use. I just don't find myself inspired to reach for it that often because I've got smaller palettes I'm more interested in. And I'm also always really thrown off by this quadrant down here of the more colorful shades. They kind of go a little bit with the ones down here, but I just feel like they're very disjointed from the rest of the palette, right? Like this does not go with all of the warm tones over here. It seems like a really just sort of bizarre tack on area to the palette. Anyway, like I said, the quality is fine, good even. I just don't find myself reaching for it because I'm not somebody who normally goes for these kind of like pukey brown typed colors. I think they do look nice on the eye, but I'm just not drawn towards them. So I don't think to reach for this palette very often. I probably should make more of an effort, but there's so many colors in here that even if I made an effort to use it every day for a week, I feel like I would barely get through the breadth of the colors in here. So, I mean, I know it's a Morphe thing to produce 35 shadows, so I can't gripe on them about that. I just find this a little bit cumbersome because there's so many shades in here. The next one is show your palette with the best memory attached to it. And I could have talked about the Urban Decay Naked palette because my friend Dee did bring that up from New York City, but repeating palettes is a little bit not that interesting. So I wanted to talk about this one. This is the Too Faced A Few of My Favorite Things palette, and it came out for holidays 2013, I think. And this is really special to me for two reasons. Number one, this is one of the first palettes that I purchased where I kind of gave myself permission to buy more expensive makeup. At that point in time, I was going for more volume than I was quality. And while I had a lot of makeup, I didn't necessarily love all of the items that I was picking up because they were just kind of crummy quality. Like I'd be buying a ton of dollar lipsticks and yeah, I'd have 10 lipsticks, but like a single $10 one probably would have been better than 10 $1 ones, just to give you an example. So around the time that this came out, I kind of went, you know what, like spend a little bit more money and get fewer things. And I've heard this mantra being said a few times now. It's like fewer but better things, and that's sort of what happened with this. So I gave myself permission to pick up this palette, and I think it was the Laura Mercier Artist Palette. And I was so in love with the quality of this palette and that one that I was like, you know what, if I spend a little bit more money and don't buy as many things, I can really enjoy the products that I'm picking up. So that was one of the reasons that I really liked this, is because it kind of became this like catalyst for me buying eyeshadow palettes, I guess you could say. And maybe it didn't start a great trend because I've now got over 100 palettes, which is excessive, but it is something I really enjoy. And the other reason, I'm gonna close it now because it's kind of awkward holding it up like this. The other reason that I love this so much is that I brought this on vacation with me to Prague when I traveled there with my friend Kat. Oh, what year was that? I don't know. I was like 31, so I guess it was like 6-ish years ago. So I brought this palette with me to Prague and I used it for like the 7 to 10 days that we were there, and I just really got to know it really well, and I just liked for whatever reason, having this palette while I was there, it's like a core memory that just really stuck out in my brain. So I was really happy that I had not only picked this palette up, but the fact that it stuck with me as a memory of a trip that I had. So this one is very special to me, and honestly, I still use this thing. Like not every day, not even close to every month even, but I still really enjoy it. It's nice to have so many eyeshadows and then some bronzers and blushes down here. It's a great travel palette just because there's so much in here, although it is a little bit large, but because it's cardboard packaging and slim, it is easy to take with you. So yeah, really, really love this palette. The next one is show a palette worth the hype, and I kind of struggled a little bit with this one because I don't feel like people hype colorful eyeshadow palettes up that much. So I was kind of hunting through my collection to find something that I thought other people had hyped up. And the best I could do is this Tarte palette. So this is the Tartelette in Bloom palette, which is fairly neutral. I mean, not even fairly, this is very neutral. But this was one of those palettes that I feel like a lot of people were talking about when it first launched, and I didn't buy it. It was sent to me in PR, and I kind of put off trying it because I just wasn't that into the color scheme. And then we went away for some long weekend somewhere, and I only brought this eyeshadow palette on purpose, so forced myself to use it. And I was blown away with the looks that I made that weekend. I was like, wow, this palette is super flattering. The colors just seem to blend seamlessly together. And I mean, I only used it for 3 days straight at that point in time, but I was like, damn, everybody knows what they're talking about. This thing is phenomenal. And I'm sorry that the camera is reflecting so much. The packaging is really shiny. This is phenomenal. It's just so nice to use. There's a ton of matte shadows in here, which makes me really happy. But then you've got some excellent shimmers that really help to round out looks with this. And it just looked flattering as all get out on my eyes. So I, at that point in time, was like, oh, now I realize why everybody is talking about this palette. And it's not something I reach for that often, but it is one that is consistently good, so I hold on to it because it is quite pretty, and this one was definitely worth the hype. I don't think anybody is really talking about it anymore, although I'm pretty sure it's a permanent product by Tarte, but when this first launched, I feel like everybody was nattering on about it, and yeah, it is 100% worth the hype. The hype back then though, because again, no one's talking about it now. Okay, the next one is a palette not worth the hype, and I feel like I'm gonna get a ton of flack for this one because I personally know so many people that love this, but I am not one of them. The ColourPop Yes Please palette. I can't figure this thing out. My friend Sam loves this thing to pieces, but I can't get down with it, and I don't understand why. These shades are so much up my alley, but I hate every look that I create with this thing. It doesn't make any sense. It really doesn't make any sense. I love shimmery oranges. I love red matte colors. I love these kind of like burnt tones. But for whatever reason, when I create a look with this, I'm always like, really? That's the look that you created with it? I don't know what it is. I just can't make anything out of this that I think is appealing. And I have tried. I've tried so hard to make this thing work just because I know so many people are enamored with it. And I'm not. And I'm holding on to it for that one moment in time where I use it and it all just clicks and it works, and then suddenly I'll realize why everybody loved this thing. But I gotta tell you, I don't reach for it because every other time has been a miserable experience using this. I don't feel like the blending was bad on this, or even the colors were not pigmented or anything like that. Like, I don't feel like there's a performance issue. I feel like it's a me issue. Like, every time I use this, I choose the wrong color combination. So yeah, I'm not in love with the Yes Please palette, even though this was super hyped up, but no, not worth the hype in my book. The next one is show your favorite palette from a favorite brand, and I could have mentioned the ColourPop Chasing Rainbows palette because that is an absolute favorite of mine, but again, repetition is boring, so I'm going to talk about the Too Faced Peanut Butter and Jelly palette. I love this thing so much, and I don't know why they discontinued it. When this came out, everybody flipped out. And I think it was only available at Ulta at the time, and I don't know how I ended up getting my hands on it, but I was so excited to get my hands on this thing. I love this intensely. It is so much fun for this tiny little 9-pan palette. I'm so taken with it. I love the fact that the colors on the side aren't just like your basic boring versions of a cream color, which is generally what Too Faced tends to do with these 9-pan palettes. Not that they've made them in a really long time. I feel like they've kind of discontinued this format. I love the fact that this was based around the Too Faced Semi-Sweet Chocolate Bar palette and the peanut butter shade, and that they took that color and just blew it out into a whole palette. I would have been happy with this as like a 12-pan palette. That would have been super exciting to me. Or a bigger one. What are the larger ones, the chocolate bars? Are they 18? Anyway, as a 9-pan, this still just really got me excited. I love all the peanut buttery, like warm shades. I love the fact that they've thrown this random purple in there because it actually does really work with the rest of the palette, and the deeper purple too does help to sort of like flesh that out. I also really love the gold in here too, which is fairly unique for me because I don't feel like golds tend to look that good on my skin tone, but there's something about the shade of that sort of pale yellow gold that I think looks really good on me. I'm just so pleased with this, and I'm sad they discontinued it, but I realize over the years they kind of have to shuffle products out of their line. But this one is super lovely, and I'm so glad that I have it. I really do need to pull this out more recently just because I love it so much. It's been one of those ones that's kind of gotten a little bit forgotten in my collection, but this one is a true treasure of mine. The next one is Show Your Most Used palette, and honestly the Naked original palette is probably my most used over the years, but that's just because I've owned it the longest. Chasing Rainbows is another one I've used the most, but I've already talked about those, so I'm going to talk about another one that I've used the most, and this is the Too Faced Semi-Sweet Chocolate Bar palette, which kind of works because I just mentioned the Peanut Butter and Jelly palette, which took a shade out of this and turned it into that palette. So it's no surprise that I really enjoy this one too. I like this so much more than the original Chocolate Bar palette. This one is just way more up my alley in terms of neutrals, and sadly this has been discontinued, which just annoys me, but I know why it happens. Anyway, there's no pan in this palette, and I really don't think I will be hitting pan in any palette going forward just because I have so much, but this one definitely has the biggest dips in the pans, so maybe I'm close to hitting pan, but who knows. The Nougat shade over here has a massive divot in it because I use that a lot as like a transition color. Butter Pecan has a nice dip in it as well, so does Peanut Butter, because that shade is perfection. That thing is just wonderful. I even love the like more taupey colored shades in here, like Puddin' and Rum Raisin, Caramel and Bonbon down here. These are gorgeous, kind of like beachy, shimmery shades. I always think about bringing this palette when I go to like a beach vacation for some reason, and I think it's truly because of those two shades. I love the fact that there's a black in here too, so I can deepen any of the colors up. I'm so in love with this palette, and I really wish they hadn't gotten rid of it. Oh, and also the fact that this is like the slim version of the palette. When I bought the original Chocolate Bar, it was the chunky boy status one. Like it's got some girth to that thing, and I found it really cumbersome to reach for that palette. So when they switched to the more slimline packaging, I definitely found myself reaching for the Chocolate Bar palettes more. And I know they did eventually change the size of the original Chocolate Bar, but I still have the big chunker, so. But anyway, I really love this palette, and it's definitely become like my more used one over the years. And the very last one it says to show is your most underrated palette, and hands down, that's this Tarte palette. So it says Young, Wild, and Cruelty Free on the front, but I don't think that's the name of it. No, it's called the Unleashed palette. This is freaking amazing, and nobody talks about this thing. It's, I don't know, this is not really a neutral palette, is it? No, it's not, I guess. It's colorful, but it's on the like neutral side of colorful, I guess you could say. I think this palette is just phenomenal, and yet no one talks about it. I did a review probably about a year ago, and I loved this thing to pieces. Every look out of it was so much fun, and I just find the shades really complementary in here. You can do so much with this thing. I mean, you can stick to like the more orangey tones over here, or you can grab some of the like the more turquoise colors. And honestly, now that I think about it, this is like a toned down or just smaller version of the Morphe and Jaclyn Hill palette. It's kind of like they took that color scheme and condensed it, because like the blues are very similar. There's some of those like warm shades over here. So I feel like this is like a better version of the Jaclyn Hill palette now that I'm thinking about it. Anyway, everything about this palette just seemed to really work out well together, and when I get one of those palettes and I start using them on the eye, I just feel a sort of like affinity for it, because sometimes you can get a palette and you just don't know what to do with it, but with this one it just seems seamless. It just worked out every single time, and I think that speaks volumes about whoever pulled the shades together for this palette, that they really just knew how you could use them together. And I really like that as a consumer, because although I'm fairly creative with my eyeshadow looks, at the end of the day I don't want to look at an eyeshadow palette and go, what am I gonna do with you? And I don't feel like that happens with this one. And even if I do sort of screw up and put together two colors that would not necessarily be what I would normally choose, they somehow still work with this thing. So whoever chose the color scheme for this Tarte palette in particular, you did a wonderful job. And I wish more people talked about the Unleashed palette. I feel like no one's mentioning it. I don't see it pop up in any videos anywhere, but this is phenomenal. This is really underrated. So that is it for the Eyeshadow Palette Tag. I had a lot of fun with these not really questions, but like show me a thing. I felt like it was really insightful. It made me think a little bit more about my collection, and it was fun to dig out some of these palettes that I definitely haven't talked about in a long time. So I hope you found this interesting because it was a lot of fun for me. Thanks for joining me today, and I will hopefully see you next time. Bye.